Okay. Good afternoon to you all. We have once again our afternoon talk, Thursday afternoon talk, this week with Professor Jean-REMI Lapaire from Bordeaux Montaigne University and Morgane Mozzi. Before we start, first of all, I call your attention to the title, which is very motivating. Professor Lapaire is going to talk about hand and mind, what gestures reveal about human cognition in argumentative contexts. So it's a very interesting title, and we are looking forward to hearing Professor Lapaire. But before, I would like to say a few words about his academic career. Professor Jean-REMI Lapaire is the co-founder of the French Association of Cognitive Linguistics. The short name for that is AFLICO. He teaches linguistics, gesture, semiotics, and language education theory at Université Bordeaux Montaigne, UBM, France. His current research, theoretical and applied, is focused on sensing, moving, and cognizing human body, acting as an articulator and interpreter of situated social meanings. He has designed and tested new strategies in language education, spoken, written, visual, kinesthetic, which engage educators and students more fully in dynamic forms of observation and reasoning, while redefining spaces and strategies for reflection, creativity, and analytic journaling in such diverse fields as grammar, pragmatics, poetics, literature, and discourse analysis. Morgane Mozzi has an MA, she is a Master of Arts, and a postgraduate student in gesture studies at UBM. She has worked on gesture, conceptualization, and persuasion from both traditional, rhetoric, and modern semiotic perspective. So these are, in synthesis, the academic activities and achievements of both Professor Lapaire and Morgane Mozzi. And now I have the pleasure and the honor to pass the word to Jean-REMI, who is going to talk first, and then he's going to give the chance for Morgane also to continue the presentation. Be welcome.
Boa tarde a todos. O meu nome é Jean-REMI Lapaire, sou professor de Linguística Cognitiva e Estudos Gestuais no Departamento de Inglês da Universidade de Bordeaux-Montaigne, no sudoeste da França. Estou acompanhado por Morgane Mozzi, uma brilhante estudante que escreveu uma tese de mestrado sobre a função do corpo e os gestos na argumentação. Vou falar primeiro a apresentação do tema e do corpus. Morgane falará então sobre o estudo empírico que fez e fará a conclusão. Tomarei novamente a palavra para comentar a bibliografia e responder às vossas perguntas. Morgane e eu não estamos no mesmo lugar porque ela está doente em casa. So, you know, that was my just brief intro in Portuguese, and I think I'll carry on in English. It will be, you know, easier.
You did marvelously.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
So, Hand and Mind, you said it was a lovely title because I stole the title. Hand and Mind was used in 1992 by McNeill when he launched, if you like, a new paradigm within gesture studies that established that hands, especially hand motions, hand movements, played a crucial role in conceptualization. That, when we think and think hard, in fact, and we use our hands, sometimes when we just think by ourselves, but also and mainly when we talk to others and want to explain things. So basically, hand and mind is in a way his title, but the rest of the title is ours. What gestures reveal about human cognition in argumentative context is our own contribution to tonight's presentation. So I like starters. I'm French, so we always have hors d'oeuvre starters when we eat before, the main course. And so starters or hors d'oeuvre tonight will be just very simple pictures that I think we all need to get going and understand things. Now, these are pictures taken from a documentary film on gender and transgender. I will explain in just a moment when this film was made and who took part in the film. But there are two academics being interviewed about performing gender and gender identity in society. It's in the third part of the documentary film. One is Italian, Professor Marco Pustianaz, and this is what he has to say. He says, fluidity, we're talking about gender fluidity, means basically life. And as he says life, just watch his hands. He has this lovely, this is called the frame gesture or open palm gesture, in which basically he seems to be, in a way, holding life in his hands, as if it were like an invisible abstract object. And he does a post-stroke hold, which means like he holds it for a second or so. It doesn't vanish. It stays for just a tiny fraction of a second. Then just a few moments later, he says, nothing in life is fixed. Look at his hands, nothing. This is again another version of the frame gesture, which clearly is co-expressive with the notion of fixity. What is interesting here is that gesture, those manual gestures, co-occur with speech. They are synchronized with speech. And not only are they synchronized, but they are co-articulators, they are co-expressive of the meanings that are being conveyed, but not just conveyed, the meanings that are being performed in front of us. Then there's an American speaker, Michael Stambolis, who is in fact an assistant professor of gender studies at my university. So he is American, but he teaches and works in France. And he here talks about gender fluidity and various forms of fluidity. And as he says fluidity, his hands, again, co-express that notion. And also there's this head tilt, which I think is also part of the expression probably of, fluidity, whatever the head tilt might mean. Again, at some point, he talks about walking into a classroom dressed as a woman and to just watch how his students would react. And part of the gear he uses is wearing earrings, large dangling earrings. And he mentions at some point in the interview that he's had his ears pierced. And he, in fact, touches his ears. He both points to his ears and clearly shows us that his ears were pierced there. But it's this allusion to when and how his ears were pierced that, again, is expressed verbally, but also kinetically. This combination of gestural action and verbal action. And he talks about the small earrings that men wear, small, discreet, which all men, at least in France or in the States, would wear. I don't know in Brazil if they would, but which are okay. People wouldn't call them, sissies or gays or whatever. And if small, discreet, earrings are okay with men, mainstream heterosexuals. That large dangling earrings, of course, would not be okay with mainstream males at least in French or American society. And then finally, one last picture. I've had my students for a semester, and this is how basically he evokes the duration. So you see the expression of duration is both verbal and manual. So these are very simple examples, simply for you to kind of understand when I mean speech and gesture are co-expressive, gestures are co-articulators of meanings. You have very clear, very simple instances of this on these pictures. So this is basically, the body that expresses such meanings is called the intelligent body by a wonderful German scholar, Streeck, who has worked on both cognition and gesture. So basically, what Streeck and McNeill and others, including myself, say is that thinking and reasoning happens, with the medium of gesture. That, as we think and reason, we use our minds, we use verbal language, but we also use gesticulation, which produce what might be called manual displays of meaning, life, for instance, or gender fluidity, or fixity. Remember the gestures that went where, the manual display of the notion of fixity, of fluidity. All this is, done with the hands in particular. So all these manual displays give sensory reality or kinetic form to ideas, events, and processes. Suddenly, rather than just listening, hearing, we can actually see the meanings that are being expressed, however abstract they might be. What happens too is that the hands we watch are not just hands. We're not like watching and say, oh, that's his right hand moving, that's his left hand moving. The hands refer or denote something other than themselves. It's a symbolic use of hands. The hands can become life. They can be fluidity. They can code any concept, any process. So the hands are used to depict, to narrate, you tell stories, or to produce arguments. Basically, the hands here are used not just as hands. They don't necessarily stand for themselves. They stand for something else, a process, an event, a scene, a concept, an idea. So this means that the space in front of us, which is called the gesture space, is used symbolically. It's not just a space. It's a space where my hands are moving as I talk, and that space is known as the gesture space. But that gesture space has communicative functions, but it has also narrative functions, argumentative functions. This is where I perform some of my reasoning, some of my storytelling happens there in front of me. It happens there on my lips, but it happens also there in front of me within the gesture space. So speech, in fact, what I'm getting at, it is very simple, is that speech is a socio-physical performance, that basically speech is not just speech. Speech is speech behavior. It's a social performance. The entire human body is used to articulate meanings on the stage, and the stage is the socio-interactional stage. We all, in fact, perform the meanings we wish to express on the socio-interactional stage. That's basically why we are also actors and movers. Now, at a more discourse-specific level, and this is what Morgane will be showing and establishing, and so I won't go into any detail here, is that when we speak, when we talk, when we reason, publicly at least, it's a multimodal process, usually governed by systems of goals and intentions. We want, in a way, to persuade people, we want to convince them, we want to move them. There are a number of things we want to do as we speak. We have usually unstated or sometimes clearly stated goals and intentions, and to achieve these goals, we, in fact, use a combination of verbal and non-verbal means and acts. So some form of cooperation and adjustment here is required, and Morgane will discuss this. So just to finish my own little intro before Morgane continues and presents her case study, what basically are our objectives and current hypotheses? Well, our starting point is that speech is a kind of manipulatory activity. This is what Adam Kendham, one of the greatest gesture specialists, living, gesture specialists, wrote. That was in his conclusion. He wrote a really landmark study called just simply Gesture, which was published in 2004 by Oxford University Press, and which is listed in the bibliography. And when he thinks of gesture as a manipulatory activity, if we look at what manipulatory means, we know that manipulation basically means physical manipulation, to handle with skill, to turn, to reposition. That's the OD definition. And is this from manipulus in Latin, which means a handful, from manus in Latin, which means hand. Of course, you are Portuguese speakers, so you know manus, mão in Portuguese, or manus, main in French. They're very similar. That's the hand. So manipulation basically is about using one's hands to handle things with skill or dexterity, to create, to exchange, whatever. So this sense of physical manipulation does apply to language as well. When we talk, or when speakers speak, their hands physically and symbolically manipulate abstract objects. As we talk, or as speakers speak, meanings are shaped. And so speech is a form of manipulatory activity. And meaning making is a form of making. And this is Kendham's hypothesis. One of the reasons the hands are crucially involved in meaning making is that we are the fabricating species. He says, we love to create, to manipulate physical objects, but we also, in fact, are creators and manipulators of abstract objects, which are meanings. So speakers use their hands to create, designate, and manipulate virtual entities. So basically, this physical manipulation, which is partly physical, partly symbolic, is basically, a form of manipulation. Now, the second form of manipulation is that speech is also socially manipulative in a more metaphorical sense. We try as we speak, and this is very important, and this is the central part of our hypothesis, is that the first form of manipulation, physical manipulation, which I have just mentioned, works in combination with socio-cognitive manipulation. Now, not in a negative sense, like he's trying to manipulate me, he's trying to deceive me. Of course, there is a form of control. It's not necessarily done for evil purposes. It's simply trying to persuade people, to influence them, so that basically what I'm doing now is manipulative. I'm trying to convince you that what I'm saying is correct. And I'm trying to persuade you in a way that gestures are co-articulators of meaning, and so on and so forth. So what I'm doing now is also a form of social manipulation. I want to influence your thoughts. I want you to think like me, to follow me, to be with me in this. So basically, the two meanings are combined, usually combined, so that the gestures we make as we speak provide a skillful way for the speaker to manipulate concepts, create meanings, manipulate concepts and abstract objects, and at the same time, influence the listener and the viewer's understanding of a given topic or situation, which is the case here with gender identity, or in the case of the documentary film, what is gender identity about? What is fluidity of gender? Fluidity of gender is not like a form of perversity. Fluidity of gender is natural, it's there everywhere, it's acceptable, etc. So to convince people that, being gender fluid is fine, you have, in a way, to display a number of concepts manually and verbally. And for instance, this is exactly what happens in the documentary film. So just before Morgane continues with her empirical study and presents it, I'd like simply to present the material and the methods that we've been using. Morgane performed a micro-analysis of 40 minutes of video footage, which is, in fact, when we interviewed, as I made this documentary film, I did this interview with Michael Stambolis in particular. And it was just 40 minutes with just like, of video footage. We never told anyone, we're filming you because we want to observe your gestures. No, the purpose was just like to present, gender fluidity, explain how things work. So basically, I was interviewing him. There was a technician who basically was all by himself. That was the camera crew, as we called it, André. And there were interviewees, not sitting in the same, I mean, we interviewed them. These were studio interviews, but also we filmed them outdoors. There was Vanessa, an undergraduate student who was transitioning from M to F and who has now successfully transitioned. There was Jane, a graduate student who cross-dresses as a man when she comes to classes. There was Marco, the guest Italian professor who specializes in queer studies, and Michael Stambolis, that I just mentioned, who is associate professor of sociology of gender, who was actually the one person I interviewed. Now, the great advantage of using this as data was that this kind of data is I think, provides you with the best of both worlds. Why am I saying this? It's naturalistic. It's a real life situation. In real life, people get interviewed. People go to television shows. People are filmed as they explain things or as documentary films are made. So it was not something that was completely artificial. So it was naturalistic. It was true to life. Yet, at the same time, it was a controlled environment, very much like a lab. So in a lab-like situation, when questions are very clear and focused, and so as an interviewer, I was in a way controlling things. So also the camera shots were nicely framed. So basically, in over 90% of the shots, the hand activity, the facial expressions were visible, and in HD. So basically, if you want to watch the film, you may find it. It has been released in various countries, but it's available even, I know, in Brazil. If you type "doing and undoing gender" at and Lapaire, my name, or "doing and undoing gender," you will find the movie. It's captioned. It's got subtitles in so the French part. The French interviews have English subtitles, and the English interviews have French subtitles. But basically, you can follow it. This is the international version. The French version is mélange des genres, literally the mixing of gender. So basically, now I'd like to, this is where I stop, and Morgane is going to present the results as we filmed, and then she just examined how Michael actually was, basically explained how the fluidity of gender operated, differences between fluidity of gender and transitioning. I mean, he had to define a number of concepts and explain a number of notions, also allude to a number of historical events, and all this he did with his words, but also with his hands and gestures. So this is where I stop my own presentation, and I would like now to pass on to Morgane and see if she can share now her screen and give us her results.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Okay, so now I'll share with you some of the results of my empirical study titled Persuasion at Hand. First, I think the first important element to keep in mind is that gestures always serve a purpose. They have a number of expressive functions, and one of them is to give visible shape to invisible concepts or mental images. This, of course, is bound to affect the audience. So gestures are major tools in the art of persuasion, especially in public forms of talk. That is why the rhetorical dimension needs to be addressed. To do so, I will use the Aristotelian model of traditional rhetoric, including ethos, the speaker's credibility, logos, rational argumentation, and pathos, emotional appeal. The main reason for that choice is explained by Isabella Poggi, because she argues that these strategies are always present in persuasive discourse. So I will use the Aristotelian model and my empirical findings to show you when and why the speaker uses his hands to manipulate concepts and influence the viewer's vision, way of thinking, and, well, comprehension of gender-related concepts. We will start with ethos, or the speaker's credibility. It's one of the three modes of proof included in the Aristotelian model. This strategy is crucial because in my study, the speaker, by engaging in discourse, is trying to accomplish a goal that can be summarized as convincing, persuading the audience to reconsider, rethink their judgments of gender-related norms and concepts. So ethos is important because we need to understand why and how the speaker presents himself as a reliable source that the audience can and should trust. Having strong opinions alone is not enough to convince someone, but introducing oneself as a reliable source could be. As Dorico and Poggi explain, one of the persuader's goals is self-presentation. In fact, the speaker must introduce himself as a competent source who has nothing to gain except the adherence of others to his beliefs. In other words, the speaker must project an image of honesty and reliability for the audience to adhere to his goals. In my study, I identified several types of ethos-related gestures, including the open hand palm facing forward, the globe gesture, and the alternation between the open hand palm forward and the open hand palm backwards facing the audience. I'll come back to that. But first, we will focus on the open hand palm forward, men on one side. It is through this gesture that the speaker exposes facts to the audience, using the inner face of his hand as a support on which the signified concept is displayed by the signifying gesture. I think that abstract concepts are given shape, and I would almost say substance, through this gesture because they can be displayed on physical support. So that's interesting. The second element is that this gesture draws the audience's gaze to the speaker's palm, and therefore to a fact presented as true. For example, here, the fact that men are usually associated with one gender box, whereas women are associated with another. This gesture, I think, is persuasively powerful because the hand does not belong to just anyone, but to a speaker who is considered reliable. If viewers were confronted with a speaker whose reliability has yet to be proven, we could suggest that the value given to his gestures would be very different because they serve to introduce realities. And the same applies to the globe gesture, through which the speaker gives substance to abstract concepts. Here, abstract concepts are embodied and brought to life through gestures. That's very important because by performing them in the gesture space, so in the space available in front of him, the speaker embodies these concepts, therefore making them real. So when the speaker embodies a third gender through gesture, he brings this concept to life for his viewers. He performs it before the eyes of the audience. And again, I think that the persuasive power of this gesture is tightly linked to the trustworthiness of the speaker. Of course, the power of the gesture lies in its form because it gives substance to abstract concepts, but it's also demonstrated by the confidence in the speaker that viewers acquire over the course of his argument. The same applies to the quick turnaround of the hands, through which the speaker introduces alternatives to widespread gender norms. My interpretation is that the speaker is presenting viewers with a vision drawn from his own cultural background, because the back of the hand is not insignificant. By analogy, it could be associated with concepts, ideas still relegated to the background. And because the speaker has access to these concepts, he can reveal the hidden side of the norms. So, in fact, ethos ethos has its importance in strengthening the believability of the concepts introduced. I'll soon explain how the speaker gives value and credibility to his arguments by appealing both to logos and ethos. But one should keep in mind that apart from logical and emotional appeals, one partly accepts a speaker's belief because he or she trusts him or her. So ethos-related gestures enable the speaker to give shape to mental abstractions, to offer them to the audience. And so ethos is very different from logos, the strategy we will be examining now. Because logos is used by the speaker in order to show the audience that the introduced concept is valuable, but more importantly, that it is consistent with others and previous concepts introduced in the interview. And this is a device referred to by Derrida and Pogge as showing coherence, or the logos aspect of persuasion. Interestingly, Pogge also defines rational persuasion as a cognitive goal hooking, referring to a case in which the speaker hooks his goals on those of his addressees by leaning on their reasoning. And to achieve this, the speaker must demonstrate logical and relevant links between the different beliefs and concepts it presents in order for the audience to create cognitive connections. This is what happens with the frame configuration gesture for boys to wear and for girls to wear. Here, the speaker divides the gesture space into several sections, each corresponding to a particular gender. Two realities are in fact associated with gender, but they cannot intersect. By dividing the space into two distinct entities, the speaker shows with his hands, and more precisely the sides of his hands, that there are two realities associated with gender, but they cannot intersect. So he represents the immutable aspect that is supposedly inherent to the norms of gender binarity. He provides the audience with a clear mental and physical framework by relating on their existing assumptions in order to better modify them. Using logic is the way for him to help the viewers understand for themselves why certain gender concepts need to be rethought. The framing configuration enables him to frame, literally, gender concepts in separate spaces, shaping them along with his audience's thoughts. In fact, when the speaker mentions characteristics typically associated with girls, he makes a globe gesture on the right side of the gesture space. But when he mentions characteristics associated with boys, he makes the same gesture to the left side of the gesture space. So what he wants to do is to represent, well, and to show that the complexity of gender, in fact, cannot be captured by overly strict rules. And he gives an interesting example to prove his point, because he says that in the 19th century, in the United States, pink was a masculine color, but it is now a feminine color. And blue was a feminine color, but it is now a masculine color. So it leads him to argue that gender norms are socially constructed. These ideas are interesting when it comes to conduit metaphoric gestures. To make things clear, I read the definition given by David McNeill. So conduits are metaphors whereby language, meaning, knowledge are presented as bounded containers. The conduit is actually a family of related metaphors which runs like this. Meaning is a substance, substance is packed into a container, and the container is passed on to a recipient over a conduit. And here, the speaker shows the supposed logic between different social processes, and here typically sexual orientation. Because men, as a substance, is packed into a container, the speaker's hand, and passed on to a recipient, women, over a conduit. That's how he decides to represent sexual orientation. But in fact, it's not really how it works, really. So a supposedly normal process is shown where an entity, men or women, is naturally attracted to another entity, men or women. The use of conduit metaphoric gestures is a way for him to perform processes that are widely accepted as the norm before the eyes of the audience. But what happens then when we come to the description of men being attracted to men? Well, the hand that represents the codes associated with femininity must enter the space supposedly reserved for those associated with masculinity. So we see that it's not really appropriate. It's not the appropriate way to describe sexual orientation. So he appeals to logic to demonstrate the flimsiness of norms of sexual orientation, and also to incite the audience to reconsider their perception of social processes, not as unidirectional, but multidirectional ones. Logos-related gestures, in fact, display the inferences between concepts that are displayed before the eyes of the audience. Every joint, every connection leading from one belief to the next are embodied, exemplified, performed before the eyes of the viewers. As Poggi explains, persuasion in all its forms is in need of logic, and this need is constant and unyielding. Okay, that's true. But such inferences can be subject to criticism because logical reasoning can be refuted altogether. To avoid the possibility of rejection, the strategy involving pathos enters the picture, if I may say so, with, as you'll see, very different types of gestures. So pathos, in rhetoric, Aristotle used pathos to refer to a public speaker putting the audience in the right state of mind by appealing to their emotions. The bias of emotions, however, is used not with the final goal of causing co-participants to feel an emotion, but rather to trigger an emotion that leads to the achievement of the goal. The results of my study show that iconic gestures, so when there's a resemblance between form and reference, are the most obvious forms of emotional triggering. In fact, as you'll see, the speaker shares the memory of a difficult moment in his life, thus triggering an emotion to persuade his addressees to share his conception of gender in society. Yes, I also wanted to mention that iconic gestures that will be discussed are metonymic. This is important because to describe pathos, an object is used to embody an emotionally loaded memory. Although this memory suggests the involvement of several co-participants, a certain background, and a context, the speaker chooses to summarize the entire memory with only one representative object that is depicted through gesture. Today, I will focus on the memory represented by a pair of really huge dangling earrings. The pair of earrings reminded the speaker of an embarrassing moment in his life. It was because he wore these earrings while teaching that he had to face a moment of embarrassment in front of his students. So I think it's fascinating because this iconic gesture almost traps us inside this memory through which we can feel the emotion that the speaker felt at that particular moment in his life. In other words, the iconic gesture forces us to picture an object that alone sums up a whole difficult life experience. And once the viewers are drawn into this memory, they are inclined to empathize with the speaker, therefore allowing him to direct them toward another set goal, accepting the idea that gender norms have an impact on people's lives. I think that iconic gestures, by appealing to memory, seek to trigger an emotion in the audience that serves to convince them of the veracity and relevance of the previous goal. In fact, the speaker manages to inspire sadness in an audience that will ultimately take action, so adhere to the concepts introduced by the speaker. I also wanted to share a quote by Isabella Poggi, because he says emotion has a strong motivating power, in that the goal it triggers is not only a very important, but also a particularly urgent and compelling goal, one to pursue immediately and without thinking it over. In fact, emotional appeal is characterized by a unique strength and immediacy. The gestural realization of emotionally loaded events hold a sort of primacy over gestures displaying logic, insofar as the strategy no longer aims to modify mental and cognitive concepts by means of reason, but to make the audience adhere to them without question. Okay, so some concluding remarks on all of that. When speakers physically engage in communicative and therefore persuasive action, Objects of conception are symbolically established, displayed, and manipulated. That's Professor Lapaire. Language integrates different forms of manipulation, physical, cognitive, but also social interactional, and all operate in synchrony at different levels of semiotic expression, as gesture observation reveals. Public forms of speech, in fact, put core semiotic mechanisms under a magnifying glass, because everyday speech is manipulative. Speakers always want to exert some kind of social, physical, and social cognitive influence on partners. Maybe you want to
show the bibliography? Yes, could you just press on?
No problem.
Yeah. Do you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. So very briefly, I know that some of you are familiar with gesture studies, maybe others are not so familiar. So I would simply like to just point to a few books, monographs, or articles that I believe are really landmark, or at least very, very meaningful and helpful. Now, the bird whistle essays on kinesics and context is now, most of these essays were written in the 50s. They are quite extraordinary because basically bird whistle considers that language is body motion, is part of a broader thing, which is what he calls body motion communication. But I would say this is more like period interest. Calbry, this is the second book by Calbry Geneviève, who was a French gesture specialist. She's now retired, but she wrote a number of monographs in French, and one was translated into English, and that's Elements of Meaning in Gesture. This is a fantastic book because she's a structuralist. She's the only gesture specialist who has actually tried to, she's kind of mapped out the kind of fundamental gestural patterns and their associated meanings in Western languages, with a focus on French, of course, but also English. So it's a very, very useful and extremely rich and fascinating book. Goffman, The Presentation of Self, I mean, this is very much like bird whistle, social performance of language, that's something, but to be more narrowly focused on gesture, I would certainly recommend reading Kendon, Adam Kendon, Gesture, Visible Action as Utterance. This is meant to be one of the kind of most, if you like, authoritative study of gesture, which includes also a look at gesture in art, and also in Italian culture, not just in language, gesture in painting, gesture in sculpture. So that is also very interesting to see the connection. Morgane, could you show the last? Yes, references. Then I published actually in Brazil, not that it is a landmark paper, but it connects with what was just expressed, which is, the globe gesture, how we use certain gesture patterns to establish the reality of concepts and present them to viewers. Then there is David McNeill, Hand and Mind, What Gestures Reveal About Thought. Remember at the very beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that I had borrowed the title from McNeill. That is, to me, that's the book. When I read that book, I felt I want to do gesture studies now. It was like 20 years ago, and I felt that's my calling. And interestingly, Eve Sweetser, you know her, of course, from cognitive linguistics, said to me the same happened to her. It was the McNeill book, Hand and Mind, that got her going, and it hasn't, lost its flavor. It's still so fresh and wonderful. His 2005 book on gesture and thought, although the title sounds very appealing, to me is not half as good as the first. It's just like a variation on the original Hand and Mind, which I think are really. So I'd rather go for the Hand and Mind than the gesture and thought. And finally, Morgane, and hopefully if some of you are interested, she might send you a PDF copy of her study, The Physicality of Persuasion, it's an unpublished MA dissertation, but it's a very, very, I would say unusually good and bright one. Very rarely use the data produced by my MA students, and she's done a really an amazing job. So I would certainly recommend her own work. And Jürgen Streeck, Gesturecraft, the manufacture of meaning, he is the one who really insisted on this thing about this kind of manipulation. I mean, Kendon and Streeck had this kind of focus on manipulation, and this is a very, very good, very easy to read, very accessible book on gesture. So if you're interested in any of these books, they can be, you can order them. You ask your librarian, your university librarian, to get copies, and they're still published, and they are widely available, and they will save you a lot of time. I mean, these are really I'm thinking of the Kendon, McNeill, Calbaris. These are the 3 books which I think will save you a lot of time. With those 3 books, you can already learn so much about gesture and cognition that you will save a lot of time, and this will teach you a lot also about language and cognition, and how things work also in verbal language, because they're co-expressive. So gesture and grammar, which we didn't discuss tonight, but of course grammar and gesture work together as well. And so all this is, I think, a fascinating topic. So thank you very much for listening to us. And if you have any preguntas,
Thank you.
We will.
Yes, I think there will be some. Thank you very much for such lovely presentations. And Morgane, congratulations on your dissertation. It's really, really, good piece of work. Yes, I would like to have a copy in PDF if you could send me.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. I will send Jean-Remi my email. I think he does have my email, but anyway, I'll send that just as to make sure I get a copy. Thank you very much. Okay, now as usual, we would like to open for questions, and anybody.
There's a question.
There's a cow somewhere.
Hi.
Nice connection. Actually, and ask a question. Could you?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry, I was not listening well to. Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, perfect. First of all, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, Jean-Remi and Morgane, and thank you for the organization. Congratulations as well.
Thank you.
I am a researcher, and I'm a philosopher, and I've been working with philosophy of language for many years. And more recently, in the last 4 years, I've been working with an enactivism, which is a theory of cognition, right? That claims that action is it's constitutive of all our cognitive processes. And more recently, in 2018, I've started reading this book called Linguistic Bodies, and I've been calling this theory linguistic enactivism. And the main claim in the book is that even our non-verbal, non-gestural actions, I mean, any action can be meaningful if you are in a context of a producer of an action in someone that acknowledges this action as meaningful. So they're bringing the notion of language, of linguistic capacities, to the most simple forms of life, and this poses us the question: how should we then investigate this? And this so primitive basis for language, right? I'm proposing that we investigate forms of interaction that are non-verbal, and even before because we can. I mean, gestures are very meaningful, right? They're more meaningful than simple actions that sometimes you don't have the intention or and I'm very curious about the methodology that you used, Morgan, to evaluate this dialogue, because I am starting to propose a methodology to identify some concepts of linguistic and activism in compositional situated improvisation, which are techniques of interaction in arts.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm very interested in knowing more about the methodology of your work, and see how I can build on that, and how maybe we can talk about it.
Thank you very much. In fact, what I did was first watching the video several times, and then I looked at repetition, because all of these important gestures occur at several times during the interview. So I really focused on them, and sometimes I noticed some interesting gestures, but they were, let's say, marginal, a bit too marginal. And I'm trying to work with prototypical elements, so gestures that I thought were, well, typical of certain intentions or certain persuasive strategies. And then I looked at more marginal elements, and then decided whether or not I decided to include them into my, let's say, parts or groups of gestures, gesture families. I think it's one of, I can't remember his name, but
Simon Harrison mentions gesture family. Yes. Yeah, gesture families. Yeah,
gesture families, and I think it's a great way to deal with gestures, because you can really collect very interesting data through this.
Could you mentioned Linguistic Bodies, or is this a book you were mentioning, or an article?
Yeah, it's a book. Linguistic Bodies: The Continuity Between Life and Language.
Okay.
It's from Ezequiel de Paulo, Elena Cofari, and Hani de Jager.
Okay. Okay.
It's an amazing work.
Okay, well, thank you for letting us know, because that's just but I mentioned Bird Whistle at the very beginning, and it's true that he also, his essays on body motion communication included, there's a chapter, it's called Learning to Become a Human Body. Is that something you acquire? And he also looked at movement outside language. Of course, Morgan and I, being linguists, we tend to focus on co-speech gesticulation, the gestures that accompany speech. But gestures have been also categorized into emblems, the gestures used in sign language, the gestures used in mime, with or without the co-occurrence of language. But you're right. I mean, inaction is a paradigm I'm also kind of very interested in, and I think that we'll look at this, certainly look at this book. It's in English, or it's in Portuguese, or it's published in English. Okay.
In English, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for letting us know. Okay, that's another good read.
Thank you. I'd be very happy to read your dissertation, Morgan.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I'll send it to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Would there be another question? Does anybody else would like to make a comment, say something, ask a question?
Or react. It doesn't have to be react. It can be sharing, views or ideas, or
it doesn't
connecting this with your work.
Hi. Is anybody talking?
Oh, Josie. Hi, Josie.
Hello. I'm just wondering, I'm curious about, has there been many studies about children uses of gestures, children acquisition of gestures, and how they communicate, because they are persuasive too, right? They're very persuasive. So do you know about any studies?
Yeah.
With
Tomasello, of course, Tomasello has worked a lot on language acquisition, in particular, and his team have worked on gesture. In France, there's Elia Morgenstern. Morgenstern has worked on gesture. She filmed children. It was like a group of university teachers who would like get together on, in French schools, you don't go to, you rarely go to school on Wednesday afternoons. It's your like afternoon off, and they would have little meetings, and so they kind of filmed those like friendly Wednesday afternoons with the infants. I mean, they started filming them, I think, when they were like 6 months old until they were like 5 or 6, and looked at how language evolved, including, of course, gesticulation, how the gestures, or just very much, like language evolved. I'm personally not a specialist of, either developmental psychology or developmental aspects of gesture, so I would probably need to inquire further. But I've read stuff by Tomasello, which I thought was,
amazing,
really interesting. But it would clearly, the pointing, the deictics are very, very basic gestures that very young children use, and I would not be surprised if the metaphoric gestures came, later. Clearly, McNeill proposed a very simple categorization. I mean, there are lots of typologies of gesture, but he suggested dividing the gestures, the common co-speech gestures children or adults make, into iconics, fairly depictive gestures, metaphorics, deictics, which can be both concrete or abstract. You can point to abstractions as well, and beats. So again, I would not be surprised if the deictics came first and then were followed by the beats and iconics, and the metaphorics came last. But I would need to verify this and look at this more closely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Vinicius has a question. Vinicius?
Yes.
Vinicius.
I wrote my question because my English is not. But
Read
okay,
it out.
I will.
Oh.
I will read
I'm
out.
going to
Okay,
put it
I
on the
will.
line.
Okay. My question is linked to the relationship between technology and gestures. Smartphones and like are absorbing or taking control of human senses in last decades, seeing, hearing, and touching. The promises in this area anticipate that gestures will become an important way of interacting with machines. How do you see, you both, how do you see this instrumentalization of this physical and cognitive human capacity by the giants of infotechnology?
That's a very difficult question. I'm not sure I have the expertise to answer your question. I know that there is a field in France. They call this they call this cognitics, which is, of course, how humans interact with machines and all the gestures they make. To be honest with you, I don't have much knowledge in that particular area. What I'm a little worried about personally, when I look at children, I find that the repertoire of gestures has, in a way, considerably diminished, because most of the manual activity now seems to be like press, touch. It's a kind of fairly limited repertoire of thumb gestures, of hand gestures, which are kind of different from other, more kind of common forms of, if you play games, outdoor games, if you make your own little stuff, or it's if you create objects, if you paint with real brushes, then your gestural activity is much more diverse than if you simply even with paint. I find that people who paint by just they press on a button and they turn a picture into a painting. They simply press a button, so that in terms of gestures is kind of limited compared to if they were actually holding brushes and spreading paint over a canvas. So I'm sometimes a little worried about that, but that's like at my own personal level. I know that there are all sorts of video games and machines where people can just move, but that to me doesn't sound as rich as those real life gestures. Because would you have your own impressions or opinions that you would like to share on this issue?
I don't know. I think that to these corporations, they have to. I think that they want to manipulate, so they need to accumulate lots of data about these gestures to achieve this goal of improving this relation between machines and human beings.
Yeah.
So I think that's very, very frightening.
Yeah, also facial recognition. Yes, I mean Ekman has worked on facial recognition, and what started as just academic investigation, then now we know that it's also used for security purposes, and the same with gesture capture devices. You can actually there are all sorts of ways in which you can analyze how the human body moves, and depending on your intentions. I know there are labs, and some academics I know in Germany in particular work in such labs, but like Irene Mittelberg in Aachen, and she's working with people in science departments, and they have gesture capture equipment. But that again is not a particular field I work in. It's become now very, very broad. But it's you have a point, and I must look into this myself.
Okay, thank you.
There was something by the end of Morgane's talk. She mentioned something about I think it was a word in favor of gesture pragmatics or something like that. And she was kind of basing need in the fact that some attitudes that's as far as attitudes have to change as regards
I can't hear you.
gender. For instance, she was talking and saying that people conceive of gender interconnection between all these multiple variables
Ana, não deu para entender a sua pergunta completa porque falhou no começo.
In line, with a more, how can I say, now.
We didn't get the question.
Yes, and I'm actually
We can't hear you.
Essa conexão é para
images. It is as if I have lost connection with the internet. But you can hear. What I was saying is, yeah. Now I can. Now I'm back. Yes. What I'm saying is, what kind of ideas would you
It's not working.
Morgan have for more no, what I was trying to say is, by the end of her talk, by the end of Morgan's talk, she was kind of proposing that instead of having these classical rhetoric categories, we would be better off with some sort of pragmatics, language pragmatics based on more, how can I say, flexible categories for pointing out that things are not as stable as they might be when people gesticulate, when they use gestures. Like, for instance, people think of the men category on one spot and the women category on the other spot. And she was saying, as far as I understood, that these kind of mingle, and they are not kind of still categories, but they are subject to a multiple how can I say, interrelation of so many other subjects that, would rise in these categories and maybe making other categories. Just wondering if you have any more ideas on that, because you did mention about metonymic gestures, and you talked about, these kind of fixed, way of things, and I was kind of proposing, or maybe trying to have you say something on the less traditional, the less, have a minister here in Brazil that has kind of, said things that people did not like. Like she said that, boys are to wear blue and women and girls are to wear pink. And people were contradicting what she said and saying, no, they don't have to wear blue for saying they're boys and pink for saying they're girls. Things are much more flexible and fluid than, people have traditionally thought of.
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood your question right. So sorry if I don't really answer it. But if you're talking about the division of the gesture space between boys and girls, it's because norms related to gender tend to be really, how to say, really fixed in our society. In our French society.
Yes.
If you're a boy wearing pink, well, pink is quite accepted nowadays. But if you're a boy, like, for example, wearing huge dangling earrings, it's not normal. It's not what people expect you to do as a boy. So what he wants to show is that there is a certain rigidity in the way people think about gender, in the way people conceptualize elements, ideas related to gender, but that's not how it should work, according to him, in fact. And that's why he talks about gender fluidity, about, breaking the rules, about not having this strictly divided gesture space, but having movements of fluidity between the different spaces is much more how he's trying to convey that.
But it's hard to, when you use the human body, one of the great paradoxes is that
you answered in a way,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's the binary nature of the human body. Often people, we often think that, male versus female, up versus down, black versus white. All this is simplistic because it's binary. But the trouble with, I would say, with the human body is that we have two hands. There's what we can locate on to the right, and so it's the human mind and the human body. Everything seems to be very much in favor of always this kind of sharp division between what's kind of comes to the left, to the right. Although you can place things in the middle, it's not that easy actually to, you can actually express fluidity and continuity in gesture, but it's true that it's a lot easier to simply establish something on one side and then something on the other side. And it's true that this sharp division between what is also very common in other fields. Also, not everything receives gestural expression. As Calbris has shown, gestures are very, very common when you want to fix limits, when you want to connect, establish limits, when you want to connect entities, when you want to express wholeness, for instance, or singularity. I mean, there are I think there's a fairly small repertoire of notions and processes that receive gestural expression, and the gestures make these notions very, very visible and salient. And what is needed is I suppose is this multimodal.
Yeah, and it's. It's a pity that the connection
I'm sorry.
is not,
I think I'm going to
stable.
Anna Cristina, I'm sorry, but perhaps you could
all the time.
You could type your question and we can read it for you. Meanwhile, Josie has another question.
It's more like a comment. What I was saying is, we are very much used to black and white. It's either black or white. And we don't consider many times that there is like a vast gray.
Yeah. Yeah. But, if cognition is embodied, the body has this kind of binary. I mean, of course, again, it's kind of simplistic. Maybe it's not as clear, but basically is very often experienced as, right, left, up, down, and so on and so forth, which probably has some influence on the way we experience the world, or at least we conceptualize, and I think that was, it was manifest in this kind of discussion of gender. Again, you can express fluidity, but it's always fluidity as moving from one area to the other or mixing. So there are always at least two major reference points. It's total blending again can be expressed, but it's again you put there is always one pole and then another pole, and then you mix or you blend, but it's hard to escape this kind of binary setting. So that's interesting. I would need to again read more myself on this topic of the body influencing this kind of cognition.
This is what I had in mind when I asked the question. It's a pity that my connection is not good this afternoon. I have been, having problems every week. It seems to be okay, but this especially, today, I'm having trouble with the internet, with the connection. But anyway, basically, it was what I was saying. That people tend, as JEAN-REMI just said, to be on one side or the other. But we have got to know that there is kind of a, flexible, multiple, different sources in how can I say, influencing, all these two, so, I don't know, supposed clear sides. Yes. And I was thinking this is something to do, it's more to do with our Western culture. Because if you consider Eastern cultures, this kind of opposition between categories sometimes is not so clear. They kind of, I was reading that children, they don't impose, because like in Brazil, one of the first things people do when a girl is born is to have their ear pierced. They don't do that for the boy, but they do for the girl. And I was reading that in India, this is different. You know, until the child is about 5, 7, he or she is left free to decide, you know, whichever, whatever. Yeah. So I think it's a more welcoming and encompassing, you know, way of seeing things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Well, I think we have covered some ground. So again, if you want to, unless there's another question,
Yes.
I was going to suggest that we if you
I don't know if Monica said she
No,
has a question.
Josie has another question.
Oh, okay.
Josie? Yes. Okay, then let's.
Josie, oh yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering if we know about why do people perceive some gestures to be annoying, to be ugly and annoying, and why do people ask? Why do movie directors ask actors not to do as many gestures? Like they have to be very contained.
Yeah.
Yeah. So. Yeah, that's it. I mean, why do we get annoying? We get annoyed
by some gestures.
Not all
we
of
do.
them, but like people are talking and doing lots of gestures. Maybe some people get annoyed.
We do get annoyed, and there's a very good reason for that, is that the annoying gestures are what we call redundant gestures. They're gestures that don't enrich the meaning. They simply reduplicate what you're saying. They tend to be iconic, or at least iconic of what you're saying, and they don't if you say I went up and down, it's stupid. If the gesture is non-redundant, and says something or adds something to what you're saying. If you said I was thinking, and your hand, you're just saying thinking, but your hand expresses maybe some sort of hesitation or your stance, and you're not so sure after all, then this won't be perceived as annoying, usually, because it adds meaning, and it creates kind of richer, it says something that you're not actually saying, articulating verbally. But it's true that gestures should be, I suppose, used with moderation. And once you learn how gesture works, meaning, gestures are phased. You have what is called the preparation phase. Then you have the stroke, which is called the stroke, is when actually you perform the gesture, and the stroke is commonly aligned with with word stress. And then there is a retraction phase. And for special effects, when you talk, especially if you're a public speaker, you might present something and you hold it, and you continue your explanation, and you hold that gesture you made before, and you very slowly retract it in a very controlled way. Now, that can be very pleasant to watch and very powerful. But I would agree that too much gesticulation is annoying, kills meaning. It's a very subtle balance you have to strike as a speaker between highlighting important meanings, adding meaning, enriching the meaning through your bodily attitude, and at the same time showing some form of I would say, of restraint. And in acting, if you move too much, that, of course, is bad acting, unless it's a very specific, physical theater, or a very, particular type of theater in which you're expected to, or expressionist theater, basically move a lot. But, co-speech gesticulation can be very tricky. I would agree with you. And, we had a former president, Sarkozy, who annoyed the French so much because he was just, pulling faces, moving, gesticulating far too much, and that really annoyed people. And the next president we elected did just the opposite. He would just like sit there, stand there, and not move, which was all very dull as well. So now Macron's just kind of in between. But it was really, it was hard.
Thank you so much.
Okay. If there are more questions, it's the time to ask them now. Otherwise, Clara, Clara, would you like to say your question? No, it was only a comment.
Yes.
Okay, yes, Clara.
This balance that you were talking about, it's unnatural, no? Because the excess is already presented as out of balance. It was just a commentary.
Yeah. It's. I think it really depends on people. You know, it's also, you know, if some people speak to, you know, very loudly, some also, you know, it's you know, language is about, you know, striking the right balance. You know, most of us probably find it kind of in a natural sort of way. So I would agree with you that the you know, we usually strike a balance, but excess, unless you're trying to you know, achieve a special theatrical or dramatic effect, in which case it can work. But like on a daily basis, I think that you have, it's true to be very, very careful. You know, students, when I teach my introduction to gesture, they think that I'm going to be promoting gesticulation, saying, you know, oh, if you gesture more, people will understand you better, or if you know, and it's not at all what I teach. We know, we observe like competent speakers, and we look at, you know, when do they actually move, and when is this actually helping, and how does it help, and when do these gestures occur. So yeah, that's also an issue. When I also teach drama, and I teach my drama students to observe how gesture works in real life. Because then when you start your stage work, it's interesting to kind of use the actual properties of gesture. And for instance, I had a class this afternoon, and they didn't know about the kind of phases, this thing about, you know, the stroke, the post-stroke hold. That's something they had never been taught, and we worked on that, and they kind of enjoyed it. And also what Morgane said about, you know, masculine, feminine, there's a very, very simple thing which works when you're a public speaker, which is that you can locate ideas in different spaces. It's not so much the gestures you make as shifts in your posture. If you say, for instance, so there was this boy there, and then there was the girl. It is just, you know, boys, girls. It doesn't have to be boys on the one hand and girls on the other. It can be boys and girls, so long as that there is like a shift in your body, which simply expresses change. You change, you move from one idea to the other, from one event to the other, and that can make your speech very clear and persuasive without even using your hands. So all these are the things that we call these the postural shifts, how your body shifts positions, and very often this will express a major change in your argumentation or in your storytelling, that, you know, from moving from one event or theme or topic to another. So all these things are very, very interesting to kind of observe and study, but it's time consuming. That's what I wanted to say. Gesture looks like fun. When you show the pictures, when you show the drawings, it is fun and it isn't fun at all, because you know, annotation with Elan, which is the dominant software we use with, you know, your videos, and you know, it's you know, it can take a lot of time to establish the categories, to tag your corpus, and then, you know, to work out your statistics, your gesture families, and so on. So it's fascinating, but it is in fact fairly difficult. And what's multimodal by definition is complex, because you have to bring in, taking, stress, intonation, movement, grammar, lexis, all this combined, and that becomes very, very difficult to handle.
I can imagine. Anyway, it's been very, very nice. Thank you very much, Jean-Remi. Just 1 second, Monica. We have some friends here in the room. Professor Eulalia Lurcan is with us. At least she was a minute ago.
She was. Eulalia.
Eulalia was here. I don't know if she's still there.
Sim. Boa tarde.
Oh, yeah, there she is.
Ça va bien, Jérémy? Je suis là juste pour te voir.
Bonjour.
J'ai bien compris, je comprends pas l'anglais, mais je suis là.
Bon, merci. Merci.
Perhaps the slides helped a bit, I hope. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, for your availability, yours and Morgane. I know she's not so well. I do hope you are feeling better and will be better soon. Okay.
I hope so.
And,
thank you.
Yeah. And I look forward to reading your dissertation. It seems to be a very interesting piece of work, really. Yes. And
I will try to join you again, you know, in the kind of upcoming seminars and see if we can, you know, take part. Yes.
Next year, for sure, you're going to be invited, you and your research group. Yes. And Nara, good luck in your studies in philosophy of language. And after all, I had problems with my internet. I tried to ask a question and then nobody was kind of understanding what I was saying. But anyway, I think in the end, I put my point across anyway. Yes. All right. So, Monica, would you like to say something before we say goodbye?
No, I just wanted to thank Professor Jean-Remi and Morgane, and I hope we do have a chance to be together next year.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Me.
Okay.
Maybe we can make it here.
Hopefully.
With tapiocas. He's mad about tapiocas.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure that you knew Professor Eulalia was with us.
Yes. Merci, Eulalia. Bon.
Okay. So,
both of you.
Thank you very much and have a very nice sound sleep.
Thank you. We will. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm.